But without further ado, I'm going to talk tonight about a boat that most people in Placentia are quite familiar with, the HMS Pegasus, which came to Newfoundland in the summer of 1786. And on board the Pegasus, the captain was Prince William Henry, who was one of the third son of King George III. Being the third son, he wasn't going to be in line for the throne, so he had a bit of a colourful childhood and youth, but he was a captain of this ship when it came over. So I'm going to, and this is just the introduction. The Pegasus, the HMS Pegasus, was built. The keel was laid in June of 1778. It was launched in 1779, a year later. And it was commissioned in July of 1779. It was a frigate, a 6 to 8 frigate, a fairly large ship for being a 6 to 8. It was about 600 tons, which was a fairly big ship, manned by between 180 and 240 men, typically on board a 6 to 8 frigate. It would have had about 28 guns, 19 officers, a whole variety of other officers, lieutenants, warrant officers, whatnot, and then a couple of hundred seamen who were being drawn from, largely I'm thinking from England, for the names of the men who were mentioned in the log. It was a 6 to 8, yeah, and it also carried, in addition to the seamen, it also carried a ensemble of 23 Marines, just in case they ran into trouble, because seamen, they're not fighters. I mean, these are the guys who keep the boat going. The artillerymen are how to shoot the cannons up, but the Marines are the ones that actually go out and kill other people. The ship lasted until 1816, when it was decommissioned and torn apart at the same dockyard where it was built, the Deptford dockyard, somewhere I presume in the south of England. And here's some pictures of it. This is right from the log itself, the dimensions of the ship. This is one of the sketches, a close-up of one of the details of the ship coming into St. John's Harbour. And this is a blueprint from the Rose, the HMS Rose, which was identical to the Pegasus. And in fact, the Rose sailed over with the Pegasus in 1786 and spent some time in various harbours here in Newfoundland as well. The logbook from the Pegasus was kept by the draftsman and navigator, by a chap named James Maris. And what the log, I'm sure, well, those of you who have spent time at sea and with logs, I mean, they're there to record the voyage itself. And it would record such details as the wind at the time and the direction the ship was going in and the speed of the ship. And when they got close to shore, they would all these soundings to see how much water they were in and this kind of stuff. That's all written into the log, as well as activities on board the ship, like cleaning the ship and various activities. It's fairly mundane for the most part, right? But in this log, and Maris kept the log too. He was the one who kept it. And for those, we talked earlier tonight about trying to read, it's 18th century handwriting, and it's pretty brutal at the best of times. But as you can see, this guy was a good penman. He really drew, he really wrote well, and you can read the writing without having to go blind. So, and this guy Maris as well, he was chosen particularly by the prince because he was a good illustrator. He was what they call a draftsman, but he was a beautiful artist, as you will see from some of the sketches. This is actually pages right from the log. The logbook is basically the size of probably a legal pad. Like it's about 14 inches by 9.5 inches wide. So it's a fairly small size book. And of course you could write right in it. And then he actually drew sketches on separate sheets of paper, but you can see he would glue them right into the books itself. And sometimes, I got this fancy little pointer here I can use to show you. He also drew sometimes right on the log. So you can see where he sketched in images right in between the entries. So that was kind of neat too. But you would draw them into sheets and then fold the sheets together and then paste them into the boat. Paste them right into the logbook. So this is an example of one of the ones that that he drew and then pasted into the boat. Maris employed what's called, and pardon my French, but the Trom Lowell, which is basically a three-dimensional effect. So it looks like the photograph, the drawing, which is two-dimensional, but it gives that three-dimensional feel. And you'll see some of the drawings. You can actually see like how they have the turns up on the ends. It sort of gives that sense that it jumps out at you. That was an artistic trick that Meris employed for the log. It was largely drawn in a pen and ink, but occasionally he would use colors, sort of provide some detail to some of the illustrations, which is kind of neat. Who was James Meris? You probably can't read that, but I'll read it out to you. Meris this is the only work that is known of this man. This is the only artistic work that is known of him. There's very little else known about him. And he kept the log for the captain of the ship, because this is Prince William Henry's first trip over to the New World, and he chose Meris because he was such a good illustrator, because he wanted to have a document of his entire voyage. So that's why he chose Meris to come with him and draw, and it was his job was to draw or sketch as many of the places that the ship was in, and including the shoreline and harbors and whatnot as well. So because it was supposed to be like a record of Prince William Henry's voyage to the New World. Meris served on the Pegasus as the schoolmaster, which was a pretty normal role for a man of his station, a pretty standard position in the Navy, and his duty was to instruct all of the junior officers and junior crew, because this is manned mostly by adult men, but there could be children on it, like 10, 11, 12-year-old boys who joined the Navy, just like many of the young English sailors did, right? So his job was to navigate the ship, keep the log, and also educate the junior crew members. Meris was personally appointed to come on board the ship by the prince, so that gives him an extra special little kind of position on the ship itself. Although he was quite talented at navigating and also drafting, his shipmates thought that he was crazy. So, and I'll tell you more about that as we get later towards the end of the talk. You can see that Meris began drawing or sketching as soon as he got on board the boat, because the boat spent several weeks in Plymouth in the south of England before it set sail. And these are these are just beautiful illustrations of the Plymouth waterfront from 1786. You can see looking out there, looking in the harbour and then looking out the harbour. And then when the ship left Plymouth, was in, I think it was in May, or actually early June of 1786, it had to go first to France, where it picked up a cargo of wine in the Guernsey Islands, which was part of England at the time, in the harbour of St. Pierre. When I first saw this on St. Pierre, I thought, holy smokes, that's what St. Pierre looked like, but it's not. But St. Pierre in the Guernsey Islands. And then it left Guernsey in early June, headed to Newfoundland. And here you can see this is or I guess you can't read this well, but this is the entry in the log on June 25th, 1786, and that's when the Pegasus first sights Cape St. Mary's. So they came across, and these are illustrations of Cape St. Mary's, and Point Lance over here. So it's kind of mundane, but it's neat that this is the first view of Newfoundland that the man on board the ship had seen. So that was kind of cool, right? And there's another one, maybe. Yeah, the first harbor that the ship actually came into was Trepassey, and it got there before the Rose, but it met up with the Rose and it got to Trepassey. And I wanted to show this. This is one of his planned view of Trepassey. And this is an air photo of Trepassey off Google Earth. And you can see the detail. And this is drawn on the deck of the ship. But look at the detail. And it matches very close to the actual, land, right? That was there. So that just goes to show you, the detail of that this man was able to command, when he did these drawings. And here you can see this is coming into Trepassey Harbor, right? So he's got all of these sort of really beautiful, sketches of his voyage over here. Let me see here. This is another one showing from within the harbor, I think. And there's more. This is one. Okay, it says this. Thus appears Trepassey Harbor when within the Poles. Now, anybody ever been to Trepassey? The Poles are these big sort of hills right out the edge of town. This is the pole. They call them Powells, but right, there's whatever way that you pronounce it if you're from the southern shore. So this is what it looked like to him. While they were there, they spent about 2 weeks in Trepassey, I think 10 days. While they were there, an American brig came into harbor, and this was 1686, 3 years after the American Revolution ended. So they were still very, very sketchy about the Americans coming into what they considered British ports, which would have been Trepassey and all of Newfoundland. So the captain sent aboard a crew on board the brig to inspect it to see what it was carrying. It turned out it was carrying nothing. I guess it was coming in to get fish. Is probably what it was doing, right? So they didn't have any reason to arrest it, so they just let it go. But that just shows the talent of Meres. I mean, a beautiful drawing of a ship, right? So this is pretty cool. Trepassey was a place that I did some work in myself, actually, back in 1993. I did some archaeology there. And we looked at this red arrow here shows the fort. This is the Powells, or the pools, and this is the little fort on top of it. I did some work there. When I wrote an article on this whole sort of business back about 6 years ago, and I tied it into archaeology. I tied, like the drawings that Meres did, I tied them into what we know from archaeological context from where he was showing, and it turned out pretty neat. So I did some work right up on top of that, right where the arrow is, and that was the Trepassey Battery, which was built in the 1770s because of the American Revolution. And you can see it's well sited. This is looking out the harbour here, right? And this is the old sign that, of course, all the hunters in Trepassey, they've got to use your bullets for something, so you pin off the old signs, right? But here we were able to find lots of neat stuff. In fact, this is one of the gun platforms surrounded by cannonballs here, and this is us. We're all holding a cannonball each. And this is a side plate off a Brown Bess musket, which were given 50 muskets were turned over to the men in the harbour in 1779, I think is when they built the battery. So that's kind of neat because, Meres shows this as a military installation, and then we dug up there, and sure enough, it is a military installation. So that was kind of cool. And other people worked in Trepassey as well, and Meres's work feeds into this because this is his illustration, which I showed you earlier. Where that blue arrow is here was the site. This points down to this part of Trepassey Harbour, where a woman named Robin Fleming, who was from St. Vincent's on the Cape Shore, did several visits there in, I think, 2014, 16, and 17 or something. And she tested all of these areas, which shows all these houses here. So this is quite occupied in the 1786. And sure enough, she found a lot of ceramics and no structural evidence, but she found stuff that probably would have been deposited when Meres was there. I mean, artifacts that date right to the 1780s, 1770s period. So that's kind of neat for an archaeological perspective as well. I did some work again in 2017, I think, with Barry Galton, who was a professor in the archaeology department. We went and investigated where this arrow is. It turns out there was a big foundation to a building which looked very fort-like. This is it here from a fancy drone shot, and this is what it turned out. We thought it was a fort, but there's no reference of a fort ever being in Trepassey, except for the gun battery on top. It turned out to be a house, but the house also dated to around the 1780s. So I don't know whether it was this house, one that shows up in these sketches, but that's kind of neat to have that kind of, a little sort of inference to these things happening. He spent 2 weeks in Trepassey, or I think about 10 days. And the whole time that he was there, the prince never left the ship. He was struck with a rheumatic fever, and so he was a bit upset, never having got on shore. But he was comforted by one of the officers, and I don't know if this is the right one. No, one of the officers on board said, "Don't worry, Prince. You're not missing nothing. They're nothing but a drunken Irish fisherman who live in Trepassey. So you're missing nothing by not getting ashore." So that goes to show you that English military racism about the Irish at the time, which was very prevalent, especially even in this town here, right? So that's kind of neat. He left. The ship left Trepassey Harbour and sailed across Placentia Bay, and they went into Great St. Lawrence. And there he did a number of sketches as well. This is sort of coming into it. This is the harbour itself, and this is the plan. And he was kind of neat. I really admired Meres because he put the ship in every chance he had. I don't know if you can make that out in that circle, but that's a little illustration of the ship, right down in the base of the harbour, right down in the bottom of the harbour. When he got to when he got to St. Lawrence, and he went to see two towns, Little St. Lawrence and St. Lawrence. And in a letter that the prince wrote to his father, the King of England, he says in it, he said, at the west side of Placentia Bay was as far more preferable to that we left in the eastward, i.e. Trepassey, and that the inhabitants he saw there were Guernsey and Jersey people whom he considered to be peaceable and well-behaved, as opposed to the crowd in Trepassey, who we thought were a bunch of drunken Irish fishermen, but the guys in St. Lawrence, and they were from Jersey, they were from Guernsey and stuff. So, and they were probably more English than they were Irish. But anyway, they thought that they were the best kind. At least the prince did. He also went into, well, actually this is part of the St. Lawrence Harbour, but he also went into Little St. Lawrence, and here you see he also drew the ship. Right, this is Little St. Lawrence, which is not far from there. I was told by my buddy who works with me today, who's from Lawn, that I don't know why he didn't go into Lawn. Lawn is about 10 kilometers from Little St. Lawrence, and my friend is a big promoter of Lawn, but he was a bit pissed when he found out that the ship didn't make it into Lawn, but that's neither here nor there. But what he drew when he was there, which is actually a beautiful drawing, there's the Pegasus, and this is the Newman premises, right in behind. Right, this is where the ship moored. The Newman family, the Newman wine vaults in St. John's, who you probably know about. The Newmans have been were involved in intercontinental trade and in many different things since the 14th century in Devon. And they were involved in the Newfoundland fishery probably since the 17th century. But they really came over and they established premises and stuff in the 18th century in St. John's and in Little St. Lawrence and Harbour Breton and several other towns, harbours in Newfoundland in the 1770s. And here you see it. And this is quite a substantial operation for 1786 in Little Old St. Lawrence, actually Little St. Lawrence. So that was kind of nice. And here's a good record of it. Jerry Penny, an archaeologist who is sadly no longer with us, he did a survey down in that area, right on that site, probably 15 years ago, and he said we found stuff everywhere he looked. So there was a lot of archaeology, that's still to be done in these kinds of places. Where am I here? Okay. After leaving the east side of, the west side of Placentia Bay, they sailed over to here, right in Placentia. And they spent 23 pages of the logbook. About a quarter of the logbook is all about life in Placentia and the ship's time here in Placentia. He made 10 sketches. Meares made 10 sketches of the town and several more of the areas around there as well, which I'm going to talk to you about now. This is one of the ones that you probably are familiar with because this is often used. What's neat about the logbook is currently in the actual original log is in Ottawa at the National Archives. The National Archives bought it from a dealer in Chicago in 1915 and brought it to Canada and put it on display. They microfilmed, I guess, or photographed whatever in 1972 the entire log, but the clarity of it is very poor, and that's online today. Anybody can access it. But what I did, I was in Ottawa in August, and I made special attention to go to the archives in order to see the log and photograph it with a digital camera. It turned out I wasn't able to do that. They had a clerical error in Ottawa. I didn't get the log, but kindly one of the archivists there said, "I'll take it out for you next week." So I only had a morning to be there. Then we left town. And she got the log out and scanned and photographed several of the images. But then a good friend of mine named Aaron Blair, who lives near Ottawa, went to Ottawa and photographed the entire, every sketch from the logbook. I'm going to show you many of those, and I'll show you the ones that are available online and compare it to the ones that are sort of new, and you'll see they're, two totally different sort of kettles of fish, right? Where'd I go from that? So he got a number of sketches that he made of Placentia because he spent so much time here, and this is probably one of the better ones taken from Castle Hill, as you can see. And again, there's the Pegasus. This is Jersey side, as you know. This is the new fort area. This is Fort Frederick and whatnot, and Mount Pleasant and all these things, right? So it's pretty neat. So a lot of details are available from his drawings that you can sort of identify right from the picture, right on the ground today. And I'm going to try to do that for you now. There's lots of details from the harbour. Some of these are photographs, obviously, but you can see from his sketch. These are kind of neat. Like all these little grey triangles. These are piles of fish, right, that you cannot see on the pictures that are online, but sort of great detail. And as you probably know, because you live here, Placentia basically was a beach. This is from about the turn of the century, about 1900. There's no grass, but some of these guys obviously brought topsoil and made their own garden. But that's the entire beach was nothing but cobbles. I don't know how they ever grew anything here unless you brought in your own soil. Some of the things that I'll point out here. This is the new fort area, Jersey side. Here's the Pegasus. This is Mount Pleasant. This is Fort Frederick, of course. This is the naval station, which they refer. Is that Blockhouse Hill? Am I right in thinking that that's the same place? Blockhouse Hill.
It doesn't look up that far.
Blockhouse Hill, I thought was way over here. But this was the blockhouse, or this was the naval station. I don't know if there was ever really a blockhouse, but anyway, but it shows the naval station as well, which is pretty neat. As I said, I did a lot of archaeology in Placentia, mostly focused on Fort Louis, but this is just some of the excavations that we did. There's Ronnie Bishop over here, Ag King, right? Some people from the area. This is neat. This is how he shows the new fort. Now, there's two versions. This one looking down from Castle Hill. This one looking from Dunville, basically out the harbour. And here you can see he doesn't show, there's nothing left of the fort. Like this, the new fort was, Fort Louis was built in 1690s. It was fairly substantial, but not great. The English took it over in 1713, stayed there for a short while, abandoned it, built Fort Frederick in the 1720s. But they came back to the site in the 1740s and began to build what was called the new fort. Now, the new fort had a lot of substantial sort of parts of it. Right here, this is some work that we did. And there's lots of illustrations of it. But I'm thinking what he's depicting here are the ramparts, which I've outlined here in yellow on the plan for the new fort. Because I can't understand what else it would be other than whatever parts of the rampart is. And when Matt Simmons took over the project for me in 2009, I think, he excavated through these ramparts, and this is what he saw. The rubble above was added by Tom Whalen's crew when they were the engineer when they built the big breakwall out there, I think in the 60s, maybe. But this is the original. This is the new fort, and beneath that is the Fort Louis layer for the ramparts. So what you're showing, what he's showing here, is parts of these sections of the fort, which is kind of right through here. And most of this land here, most of this stuff here now is on Bernard Penny's property. So it would be nice one day if the town could take over or buy Bernard Penny out and buy that, because that's a major part of it. In fact, Bernard built his shed on top of the rampart here. That's why it's elevated so much above the rest of the ground. It's like, because it's part of the stone rampart. That's where Bernard's garage sits today. Another site that he shows here, or several others, and this is Mount Pleasant, which was the site of the first governor's house. Governor Perrette, who was actually the second governor. The first governor, of course, was killed by the Basque. Didn't care much about the French coming here. But Governor Perrette was here in the 1680s, and this is where he had his residence, which was right here. So that is where it is located here. Amanda Crompton and her crew did some excavations here back in the early 2000s, and they didn't get into the structural remains, but they did find evidence for people there. And Amanda did most of her work up on top, where she found probably one of the barracks rooms from the original View Fort, which was built in the 1670s. So this is kind of neat that he's not showing any of it there, being evident, but, I guess after a few years, everything falls down. But he does talk about the shipyard. And here, there's a ship. You can see it here. It's under construction. Right? And that's about, I'm thinking, just slightly to the, what's that way? To the east? What way is that way? North, okay. Yeah. So slightly north of where we're standing was where the dockyards. Because the Saunders and Sweetman, who were here, was a major business operation here in the 1780s. They were there since the 1720s. And they had a dockyard here. And even Maris says, or actually the prince says, that while he was here, there were two brigs were under construction at the Saunders and Sweetman dockyard in 1786. And I think that's what he's trying to show here, is the ship under construction. So that's I mean, this is Fort Frederick, so it's not too far away from Fort Frederick. So it's somewhere not far to the right of where I'm standing. So he shows that, and he shows Fort Frederick in a number of great illustrations. And this is a section through Fort Frederick from the 1770s, I think, so it's slightly earlier. Fort Frederick kind of went to ruin. It was built in the 1720s, right? But this is one of the sections here. And I just showed this because this is around, I think the shipyard must have been around right here. This is from the 1720s, this drawing here. But that's kind of neat, there's a dockyard here somewhere that no one really knows where it is, but it's got to be close to where the Saunders and Sweetman's property was, which I think was just slightly to the north of here. The other thing that he showed, and I think this is one of his nicest drawings for my money, was the naval station. And as I said, I don't know if that's Blockhouse Hill or not, but this is this is just great. Look, there's a guy stood there. There's a dog by the corner. There's another Navy guy. They got the Navy blue suits and the white pants. They're all sailors, right? That's part of the naval station. And that's it right here that he shows on his sketch. So that's kind of neat too, right? No one's ever, I don't know if anybody really knows exactly where that is, but it shouldn't be too hard to find out. But again, it's going to be, sitting on the beach rocks. He also shows great detail of the town itself, including gardens, fenced gardens out here. The town itself, of course. Now this is the illustration from the website, but you can see it's not nearly the quality. And this is taken from a digital camera, just at the beginning, or probably at the end of August. So that's pretty neat. I mean, showing all that detail that you cannot see in the other drawings. And he shows the gardens, right? He shows what's neat here, and I think the next slide will show it better. It shows, there's men walking along a pathway. There's people here carrying fish on a fish barrel, like the statue that's down next to the Newfoundland Embassy down in St. John's outside the conference center. They got that statue to women carrying a fish barrel, and here they are carrying a fish barrel, and of course piles of fish, again, right? And just lots of neat detail of gardens and stuff. And again, this is another view of the dockyard, the Saunders and Sweetman's dockyard. Also Point Verde, which are great. He shows it in several perspectives. This is coming into the harbour. This is Point Verde here. And this is a lovely one standing on back where the lighthouse is, looking back towards the town. And look at all the houses. Now there's French maps from the 1690s that also show houses. So these houses, Point Verde's been occupied since probably the middle of the 17th century. And now there's nothing out there, but there are some foundations. And Amanda Crompton and her crew back in the early 2000s, they also went out there and did some excavations and found some foundations, but not much else. Because again, you're on the beach. There's not much growing over it. But these are just beautiful illustrations that they had of Placentia itself and the surrounding area. I wanted to put in some slides about the church because we're standing in a church that was once, that just been churches here since probably the 16th century, or certainly since the 17th century. And these are some of the illustrations. I mean, Maris doesn't show a church in any of his drawings. So, I don't know why. He doesn't usually identify with a cross on the building. He didn't do it. So for whatever the reason, I guess religion wasn't his thing, right? But these are some illustrations of right where we're stood. This is 1670s. There it is. This is a fanciful version of the view fort. There it is there. This is it in 1691 when all the ferried and freebooters came and locked up all of the residents of Placentia in the church for a month in the winter of 1691. And of course, the next winter they came back, but smartly enough, Costabel, who was the acting governor, built a palisade around the town, and there's the church because they got a little cross on it, right? That's neat. And this is 1709. This is another French drawing. This is it from 1720s, and this is it again from the 1740s. So there's been churches here forever, and it's such a neat. Right here, right where we're stood, right where you're sat. People have been praying here for at least since the 1670s. So that's pretty now Catholic, and again, whatever, who cares? It's all the same God. The ancient church property, again, these are some of the illustrations of it. This is probably the 19th century. This is the one that this guy replaced, right, in 1905. And apparently this lectern here is from 1786, which I'm totally thrilled to be standing at it. And this is it here. But again, this is it again from 1670s. And again, this is the ones I showed you. But the archaeologists from Memorial came here in 1971 and conducted an excavation. This is the church, and this is their excavations, which I think are right back behind us here, right? So, and as I said, they didn't find much. Here's the pictures. These were clear. You might even know some of these guys. These were teenagers from Placentia working on the crew. I don't know who they are. I don't know, this might be your fathers, or for all I know, some of you people, right? But they didn't find much because, when you dig in a beach rock site, everything gets smashed up. So what they found was pieces of fragments of bones, but no real sort of intact skeletons. And they only worked here, I think, for a week or two anyway. So we did some work when I was here first in 2006, right behind us at O'Reilly House, which you can see, and this is us excavating it. We only did some test pitting, but we found a little bits of stuff. I think it was probably still part of the graveyard because the fence was put up more recently. The graveyard, who knows the real dimensions of it, right? But we did find John Bruce, this gentleman here, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, found this guy, which we didn't know what it was at first. It's a little pewter thing. This is my hand. But it turns out, when they got it cleaned up with the conservators, it's a statuette of St. Francis of Assisi. And if I can point this out, use your imagination now. This is a lamb. And every time he's drawn, St. Francis, he got a lamb at his feet because he was the patron saint of animals. And he was also the patron saint for the Recollect order of priests, the Suppletion. Am I saying that right? This religious order who came from Quebec. And he was their patron saint. And this little statuette was found right behind the church. And I guess the rectory must have been here as well. So I can imagine some Franciscan or Suppletion monk walking around Placentia, and this falls off of his chain. This would have probably been held on a chain, right? Like his head is missing. And fell in the ground, and later on ended up in O'Reilly's backyard. Which is just yards or meters from where I'm standing. That's kind of nice too. While he was here, the 17th, 18th, 19th century British Navy ruled with a wicked hand, and it was nothing to be lashed constantly. I mean, and the captain sort of gave out all the commands. I don't know who did the lashing. It was probably one of the crew. But while he was moored here in Placentia Harbour, which was for about a month, there was a lot of lashing went on. These are some examples here. You can see punished Thomas Flood. Oh, this is slightly off, but punished Thomas Flood, seaman, with 12 lashes for drunkenness, etc. So that's one. This guy here basically punished John Cash, John Willie, Thomas Williams, seaman, 12 lashes each for insolence. So I guess you're not being nice to the officer when he's telling you what to do, right? And this other guy here, insolence and contempt for their officers. So, I mean, they were big into lashing. This guy here, the next one down, same idea. 12 lashes each for fighting. John, whatever his name is, and Will Morgan. So they're having a scrap, right? So they got in the fight, and they got 12 lashes each, which is I'm trying to depict here from a movie because my wife is such an old movie fan. Another guy here, they lash. They were constantly not killing the sailors, but they were ruling with an iron fist. And these are written right in the logs. This is all part of the weather, the wind coming from the northeast. Somebody knots an hour. Oh, and by the way, we also gave 24 lashes to so and so for fighting. So that's kind of very indicative of the rule of thumb. They also, and because it's not that clear, they also sent a crew. The captain sent an officer and a number of the crew into town, off the ship, to witness the lashings of a shoreman who got caught for theft by the magistrates here in Placentia. So not only were they lashing men on board the ship, they also sent the guys in to witness the rule of thumb. Because I think the thing too, which you probably are all aware of, Placentia was probably 95% Irish. But of course, the authorities were English, and there was no great love lost between both of them. So it was nothing for the English authorities to lash as many of the Irish inhabitants as they wanted to. Yeah, this is the one here where he says, sent an officer with a party of seamen and marines on shore to attend the punishment inflicted by the justice of the peace of Placentia on a shoreman for theft. So, lots of tough times. There's also interesting things. Now, this is not from the logbook, But there was a guy who was the midshipman. He was like a teenager on board. His name was Thomas Barham Martin. And Tom Martin, or Barham Martin, I guess they call him, went on to become quite an influential seaman in his time and rose to be a lord. He was in the House of Lords in England in the 1800s. He was on board the ship. He was here in Placentia. He was on the voyage. He wrote several books about his life afterwards, and he included references to what happened here in Placentia. So that's really neat. And he talks about when the prince was here, he turned 21 in August of 1786. So in keeping, and the officers never mixed with the seamen. The officers were in a whole other league. So the officers all got drunk, including the prince got drunk below deck. And then he went up on deck at one point, because his cabin was on the main deck. He went up on deck, maybe to go pass out. But the crew, who were also on the big tear, because it was the prince's birthday, they all got so excited to see him that they lifted him up on their shoulders. And Martin talks about this in his book. He says he carried him on their shoulders, and they ran him back and forth across the ship so many times, and his head just missing the spars on the boat. He said, had he hit the spars, it would have killed the prince. So Barham said that he had to throw his hat forcefully at the seaman to let the prince go. And they said he basically thought he saved his life because he stopped the guys from beating the head in off him. So this is when he was up on board the ship. But that's kind of neat stuff too from the voyage. That tells you a little about 18th century or 16 or 1780s life on board a British warship. These are some additional views that Meres also drew of Placentia. Here you can see some of them are broader. This is Red Island, right? Which is oftentimes you put little people in there just to like to have a little bit of personal kind of touch, right? Some other, I think he calls Salmon Island or Salmon Island or something like that. But this is kind of neat. These are drawn right into the log sheets themselves. Different views of various parts of, what, he was trying to portray. This is what life was like in Newfoundland. This is one of my favorites. This is the view of Seven Islands. And what's kind of neat here is that, see, there's part of the crew. That's probably the prince standing up with his shotgun shooting at ducks in the harbor, right? But isn't that kind of and this is a beautiful picture, and it's kind of colorized. He didn't colorize all of it, but he added some color wash to lots of the pictures. And what's kind of special about this one, and I might be going out on a limb here, but I think Meres depicted himself. See, there's this guy here sitting down, looks like he's writing in a book, and this guy is making a sketch. See, he's got this sheet of paper that's curled up on the ends, and he's drawing this. So that's got to be Meres. That's got to be him. Sort of thinking, hey, I can put anything in a picture, so I'm going to put myself in it. And he's wearing the same hats with the same little pigtails with the little black ribbons, sort of like you would. So I think that's really neat that he shows himself, right, as well. They left Placentia after spending about a month here. I don't know quite the date. But they left Placentia for St. John's, and these are some of the images that he drew. He's a Bay of Bulls, right, one of these harbors, and various kinds of... this is the shore along between the southern shore, basically going to St. John's, right? All these different views of the shoreline. When he got to St. John's on September the 10th, and spent the last 2 weeks of the time in Newfoundland, he was in St. John's, and this is clearly the harbor, and again showing the ships. Now, the Pegasus and the Rose were the only boats. There was the HMS Salisbury, which was a much larger ship that had a Commodore on board. So that was also more than St. John's. I think that was probably there, to convoy all of the fishing ships back across the Atlantic in the fall of the year, right? So he drew this, and just to show you what this is what you see online when you go online and look at the pictures. That's what you see. This is what it's like when you get a good look at it. Look at the difference. I mean, this is the same picture, right? But it's black, everything's out. But here you can see, look at St. John's waterfront. St. John's probably had 5,000 people. Placentia had 2,000 in 1786. St. John's probably had 5,000 there, right? So it was quite an active port. And he shows lots of neat things. See, this is another view of the town, and this is Fort Townsend. Up on the hill. That's basically the same one I showed you before, but it's sort of blown up. But lots of neat houses and all the fisheries. Look at the ships there. St. John's was a very popular spot in 1786. Again, to get back to the archaeology part of it, Fort Townsend was where the room sits. right, today, and it was the subject of a big archaeology project before they built the rooms there in 2000. And you can see here, this is an illustration from, this is the 1780s or 90s, it's showing the Grand Battery. This is the Narrows. This is the Grand Battery as it was exposed. This is about 50 meters on a side. See, there's a guy here, right? Look at the size of that. That was built on, they built the museum on top of that. But it's some of the artifacts they found. This is the Queenware Bowl, again, 1780s. A Royal Artillery button, which is not that clear for you, but, and these are some of the, standing foundations. This is the foundations for the back of this guy, the Grand Battery. Because the Grand Battery, I think, had 16 guns on it, pointing in two different directions, like this way and that way, right out through the narrows of the town. Some other views of the upper part of the harbour, and it's interesting that he doesn't show everything that was there. I mean, we know from other maps and work I personally did down in this area, this was the naval dockyard and the graving yard where they turn the ship on the sides and then scrape it off and flip it over. It's called the graving yard. And a naval hospital. This, by the way, is where Shannon Dithit died and is buried. Is down in this area too. There's a graveyard down there from exactly from that period. It was a naval hospital and a watering place, because all those little waterfalls that come down over the Southside Hills, that's where they got their fresh water from, for the entire fleet for hundreds of years, right? So that's all would have been down there. This is looking back up the other way, looking out the harbour, right? This is the Narrows here. But you can see, look at all the fish flakes and stuff, and look at all the ships. It's really, Meares was fantastic. Yeah, this is all the battery. Outer battery, lower battery, inner, outer, lower, whatever it calls. I should know that because I also worked up there. But he drew, this is pretty neat. This is one of the drawings he did showing the entrance to the harbour, and he's sort of, talking about it, right? But there's some features that show up there. This is a bit more lashing, right? So, right, sort of, they were just all about that stuff. This is a neat one. This shows the ship coming into the harbour itself. This is the Pegasus. This is the longboat. They had trouble getting in the harbour. I guess the wind wasn't with them. So what they had to do was called kedging, where they used the longboat like that, which comes out. They put the anchor on board the longboat. The longboat guys row ahead, 50, 60 yards, drop the anchor, then the ship pulls itself up. Put the anchor back on board the small boat, row it ahead, drop it, and so they had to kedge themselves into the harbours, right? And he talks about that too in the logbook, right? What he had to do. But what's neat here is that, again, this is the sideways version. These are what they call, this is the mooring line. So this would have been anchored to the bottom of the Narrows, and they had these mooring cables coming up so the ships would tie on, in case they couldn't come into the harbour. They would moor off right in the Narrows, tied onto these mooring chains, right? But what I wanted to point out here was this sort of triangular shape here is Fort Frederick, circled right here. I did some work at Fort Frederick a number of years ago, and here's another drawing of it as well, sort of very, very plainly shown as sort of V-shaped emplacement. There was a gun battery here since the 1660s. So this is right in the Narrows, right in the entrance to St. John's, right? This is the reason why no one ever took St. John's by the water, except the Dutch did, of course, before they had all these defenses there. But there's a couple of beautiful watercolors from the 1800s showing the fort itself. This one here, and this is an enlargement of this one here, which is a beautiful watercolor of St. John's, I think about 1850s. But again, look, there's the fort there, right? So that's kind of, this is well before Signal Hill was built. The gun batteries here, these were built in the 1790s at Queen's Battery, so this is a bit after that. But Meares shows these installations, right? Another one that he shows, and this is right on his map, King's Wharf, right down here. And this is a drawing of King's Wharf from the 1770s, not long before Meares was there. This is what it would have looked like. This, by the way, I think this is what they call the London Tavern. It's one of the earliest taverns in St. John's, which we have some record of. And this is the same King's Wharf, King's Beach, Queen's Beach. This is where all the supplies coming into St. John's came into the King's Beach. And it was straight down over the hill. That's right where the pilot boat leaves, right? That's where the War Memorial. That's the King's Beach. That's why it's the War Memorial, because it was the King's Beach. But there it is there. And I did work there as well back years ago. We actually found parts of this building right here, back a number of years back. This is really neat because this is Gibbet Hill. Now, we all know Gibbet Hill. Well, most people know Gibbet Hill on Signal Hill. I've never seen Gibbet Hill shown with a gibbet. See? Now, gibbeting, which many of you may know, gibbeting is what they would do, was quite a cruel form of punishment. They would sometimes, they'd hang you for whatever the crime, and then they'd tar and feather you maybe, and they'd put you in a cage and hang you off a gibbet. That's what gibbeting is called. It's basically putting you in a cage. Sometimes they put you in live and just let you die, but other times they'd kill you, then they'd put you in the cage and let you rot for as long as they were fed up with you. It was built there. Edwina and I both worked on Signal Hill. We were both Parks Canada people back in the day. And the story was they put it there so that when ships coming into the harbour could see men hanging on gibbets, and it would show that St. John's was a God-fearing town. So don't fool around when you're in St. John's. But that's the only illustration I've ever seen of a gibbet. And for those who want to see what a gibbet looks like, this is the gibbeting of Captain Kidd, the pirate. So you see, basically it's a variation of a cage. This guy is wrapped up and he's basically hanged there until he rots, right? So that's kind of neat too. The other thing he shows is the old fort. Now the old fort there is Fort William. And Fort William here, shown in the 1690s. That was the Fort William was the one, I don't know if it's this one or there's another, there was the second Fort William and Mary. It was closer down by where Yellow Belly was actually now. But that's the one that the French captured or, took in 1696 when with d'Iberville and all his crowd came in and they scalped poor old Willie Drew and the planter and sent him in with the scalp tore off his head and you got to come out. So they all did, right? But that's Fort William there. And I did some work outside of Fort William as well back a number of years ago. And this is part of, there's Devon Road. So it's right, you can get the context, right downtown. And these layers here, this is the layers from the operation of Fort William. And in there we found a number of ceramics. This is ceramics right from the 1780s period, good old Westerwald, German Westerwald. And we also got some, and this is a bit earlier, but this is neat. This is off a mug. This is a medallion of King William of William and Mary fame, 1690s. We found pieces of this pot here, which is a different color. This is Westerwald. This is also white Westerwald. This is German ceramic. But it's the same illustration that we got on the mugs from right outside Fort William. So, named after King William. And here's King William, and here's a jug from his face. And these are some of the military artifacts that we found right outside the fort. This is a broad axe here. And this, for the life of me, I don't know why it's there. This is a whaling harpoon. I worked in Red Bay too. And these are like this long with great big sort of iron barbs in them. And we found that right outside Fort William. Why that was there or it was used as a weapon, I mean, who knows? But it's a military artifact right outside Fort William. Of course, the prince showing up in St. John's is a big deal. He was the first royal ever to come to Newfoundland in 1786. So, of course, the Governor Elliot, who was a Scotsman, said, we're going to have a ball because, the prince is here, like you would. So all of the important people in town were invited, and all of the captains of the ships that were in town, whether they were military ships or otherwise. So this was a big, big deal, right? The prince shows up in St. John's. So the governor calls a ball, and of course all of the women in St. John's, the wives of the big chaps in town, they all had to come. So in order to go to the 1780s hairstyle at the time was pretty wild. You've probably seen lots of it in movies. And they all had to get done up for the ball. And there was only one hairdresser in St. John's. So all the women, they had to line up. It took 2 days to do the hair for all the women who were coming. The first women who got done the day before the ball, they had to sleep sitting up, apparently. And this is what Martin talks. He describes this ball in great detail. He said the women had to sleep sitting up so not to ruin their hairdos, right? So they all had to do that. And this is they also got powdered. So this is a cartoon illustration, poorly shown here, but this is the guy throwing powder on a woman with a face mask on to powder her wig, right? So to get fresh powder on it. So, and they all would have come out looking like this beautiful woman here, right? So they go to the ball. But, of course, the prince, who was only 21, but 21 in 1786 was not like 21 today. I mean, you were pretty well a man, I think. The thing was, all the boys got loaded before going to the ball. They went to the governor's house and went on the tear, right? Knowing they had to go to the ball afterwards, knowing this was a big deal, they all got in their cups, right? And then the plan was to march from the governor's house, right here, in Fort Townsend, by the way. That's where the East End fire, not the East End, the Fort Townsend fire station was built on top of that. They marched from the governor's house to whatever building the ball was in. They must have had it in a barrack somewhere where you could put a lot of people. So they all marched there, the entourage of drunken men, including the governor and the prince and all the entourage, all in their cups. They go in there, and of course the ladies are all waiting because, they're going to see the prince. So they all line up in a row, like two parallel rows, two deep. And they're all done up, as you can imagine now. Sort of, I tried to show this in this kind of a picture. This is an 18th century wedding picture, right? But they're all dolled off with their hair all done up. The boys, of course, show up. The governor is in the bag. The prince is totally intoxicated. Barham is talking about all this in his memoirs. He says they walked in, the band struck up, but they're not sure of. It's either one of three songs, but the band were also on the beer the whole time. So they all got half in the bag. None of them played the same tune, so they weren't quite sure what they were playing. But some said it was, God Save the King. Some said there's another version of something, old roast beef of England or something. There's all great renditions, right? But of course, the governor and the prince are loaded. So they come in, and as soon as they walk into the room, they start stumbling around. The women are all done up, right? They're all waiting to be greeted by the prince. The prince falls into one of them. And Barham says that the ladies all put up their hands, and this, for you military guys, this is called a chevaux de frise. This is a military sort of device used, is an anti-horse device. They put these on the field so the horses can't run over them. He said that's what it looked like. He said the ladies all had their hair up, or had their hands up to keep the prince from falling into more than the first one. And the missus that he hit, Barham calls her a Dutch beauty. And she didn't hit the ground because she got held up by the women behind her, but she was so disheveled at the end of it that you couldn't even recognize her from what she had been, right? So with that, the prince tries to walk forward, but he's so intoxicated that they managed to pull him over and put him in the throne that they had put in the room for him, and he passed out. And he never had anything to do with the ball. They all thought, what are we going to do? Because this is a ball for him, but he's the prince, we can't really touch him. So they were able to delicately remove him and set him probably back on board the ship or somewhere else. And then the ball, they said they called for a minuet, and then the ball commenced. But the poor old prince was not part of it. So, and that was some of what he did in the St. John's. That was the last port of call for the Pegasus, and it left St. John's in September and departed for Halifax, en route to the Caribbean. They were going to spend the winter down in the Caribbean, which was a lot of English towns there as well. But the problem was when it got to the Caribbean, Maris, who, remember, his crew members all thought he was mad. Maris actually totally went mad, and despite being a brilliant artist and a navigator and a draftsman and a teacher, he tried to kill the prince twice. He attacked him twice, once with a penknife, which I don't know if that's like a pocket knife, but the second time he went after the prince with a butcher knife and tried to break into the cabin of the prince's, break down the door. But of course the men were able to subdue him, and we don't know anything about Maris after that. Maris, he gets arrested, shipped back to England. I can't imagine that he would have been promoted or survived anyway, because when you try to kill a royal, of course you're going to right to the gallows, or if not worse, right? So that's what happened to poor old Maris after that. And in his epitaph, I got his things about his epitaph here. Maris goes down. He tries to kill the prince. They spend the winter down there. He somehow gets carried on shore and sent back to England. The ship carries on, spends the winter down there. The king tried to get another illustrator or draftsman to record the rest of his trip, but he had no luck. So we don't know what happened. The ship returned back to Canada after spending the winter there, went to Montreal, went to Quebec City, and then carried on back to England. And it's very sad that Maris didn't stay, because we would have had more illustrations of Montreal and Quebec City, and who knows, many of the towns that he visited down in the Caribbean. He may have also came back to Newfoundland. Now I'm guessing the poor man is probably dead, But had he made more trips back to Newfoundland on board British naval ships, we would have such a beautiful collection of sketches of Newfoundland harbors from the 1780s and 90s and whatever. So we really, I mean, it's quite sad that he didn't, that he cracked up. But I don't know, I mean, I'm told that the prince too was no cakewalk either. He was pretty nasty. He wasn't very well liked either. He didn't spend much longer in the Navy. He retired. He entered the Navy at the age of 13. He turned 21 here, so that was 7 years in the Navy by the time he came here. He fought in the American Revolution on board ship. He befriended Horatio Nelson when he was in the Caribbean, so he became a buddy of Admiral Nelson. And between, but apparently he left the Navy, or I guess he stopped sailing at sea in 1790. It was only 4 years after his voyage here. And I guess he retired from the Navy. Between 1794 and 1807, the prince had 10 illegitimate children with an Irish comedian by the name of Dorothea Jordan. He had 10 children with poor old Dorothea, none of whom could become the king or the king or queen because they were illegitimate, right? Despite having 10 children with this woman. He went on to marry a princess from Germany and had 2 daughters, both of whom died in infancy. So he himself had no heirs. His 2 older brothers, of course, died, and then he became King of England. He was King George IV in 1830, and he died in 1837. It's kind of like Prince Charles and King Charles now. He spends, 73 years waiting to become the king, and then becomes king at, 74, or whatever Charles is today. King William IV was similar. He was probably in his 60s when he became King of England, and he lasted 7 years, right? So that was the end of him. But his niece, who was his brother's, I guess, daughter, maybe his sister's one of his younger siblings' daughter was Victoria, his brother. And then she became the Queen of England in 1837. So that was kind of neat too. In closing, I'd like to thank the Library Archives Canada, formerly known as the National Archives, for actually saving this logbook and making it available. As I told you, I had trouble getting it, but this lovely woman, an archivist there named Alexandra McEwen, was the one who helped me out and took the right logbook out and scanned some of the images, some of the ones, including this one here. And my dear friend Aaron Blair came to Ottawa and then photographed the rest of it as well. I'd like to thank Matt Simmons. I've used some of his images as well. I'd like to particularly thank Chris Newhook and all of the Placentia and Area Historical Society for inviting me here tonight to give this presentation. So, thanks so much.